Well, kia ora koutou. I hope you've all had an opportunity to have some lunch, and it's lovely to see a number of you still enjoying the excellent food that we have here on offer today. Ko Joanna Norris taku ingoa. It's my great pleasure to be hosting this panel today, which I think is one of the more important panels of the day, because it's the time when we take an opportunity to take stock, to look up, and to look out. This session, as it says in your programs, is all about reconnecting Tāmaki Makaurau to the world and why this is vital. So we're going to take a little bit of an opportunity with the panellists to take stock. Where are we up to? 2 years through COVID. What are the state of our connections to the rest of the globe? But then we're going to move very swiftly to solutions. What are we going to do to overcome challenges? It's important that today is not just about talking, but about the actions that we can take away. What are we going to do to take advantage of the position that we have found ourselves in, and how are we going to re-cement our role as a global city? So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our world-class panellists, each of who will open with some introductory comments. Our first guest at the far end of our panel is Zion Armstrong. Zion is one of the thousands of Kiwis who returned to Aotearoa during COVID. Zion had previously spent decades working globally for Adidas, where he rose to become president of Adidas North America and was also part of the core leadership group for the company. Zion is also something of an athlete. He represented New Zealand at the Kuala Lumpur Commonwealth Games, and so he really does know a thing or two about global excellence. So Zion, welcome. I'll now throw to you to talk to our topic of reconnecting Tāmaki Makaurau to the world and why this is so vital.
Thank you, Jo. Firstly, I'd like to say ex-athlete. I used to be able to jump some sticks. I look more like a shot putter these days. But fantastic to be here, an honour to be sitting in this room with so many talented people. And I just said to our fellow panellists, hearing the youth leaders just gave me so much hope. It was so cool hearing them speak from the heart. I'm going to answer the question slightly differently. Having been in lockdown for 2 years in the States with a team of over 12,500 people, the first thing I believe we need to do is focus on how we get our teams back together and reconnected, and it's not easy. And the three things we really focused on is, number one is empathy. Everyone's been away for a long time, they may have lost a loved one, etc. So empathetic leadership is more critical than ever. Secondly is equity, and that's across such a broad spectrum of areas, whether it's gender, ethnicity, pay. It's just absolutely critical that your employees are coming back to somewhere that they really feel connected. And I think if we don't do that, we won't be ready, we won't be able to hold on to our talent because they will go elsewhere. And so when the tourists do start start travelling here, we won't have teams to welcome them back to our country. So I think it's super important we first and foremost really take care of our talents and keep our culture special.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really lovely thoughts. And I think, Scott Tasker, I'll throw to you next, because Scott plays a really important role in forming those connections with the rest of the globe to allow those Kiwis to come home and participate in our economy, as Zion said. So Scott leads Auckland Airport's aeronautical commercial team. He focuses on post-pandemic recovery of airline capacity, which is a really big job, as we know. He also focuses on route connectivity and passenger volumes, filling those planes up once we've remade those connections. He has more than 20 years' experience in the travel industry, both in New Zealand and the United Kingdom, including time with Emirates and Lufthansa. Scott, over to you.
Yeah, tēnā koe. Thank you very much, Joanna. So a bit of post-lunch glass half full, how about that? So look, Tāmaki Makaurau was, is, and will always be New Zealand's internationally connected city. It's a fantastic city that I'm proud of, and I'm sure everyone here and in this room is proud of. And after 2 years of pandemic disruption, we need to regain our outward-looking, internationally connected stance. We've heard today that we aspire to be a city of innovation, of diversity, and a place where people want to live, invest, and study. It's time for us to take our rightful place again as the most connected city in the Pacific, and that international stance needs to come to the fore. And I guess the first step is we need to build our physical connections back to the world. So that's the aeroplanes, that's the merchant ships, that's the cruise ships, that will allow us to get out and reconnect to the world and for the world to reconnect to us. And look, the good news is that those connections are starting to recover. Look, it is early days, but from an aviation perspective, we almost are at 30% recovery. So from an international perspective, look, of 2019. So there's a long way to go, but we're on the path, I think, is probably the message. New Zealanders are heading back out to the world. We can see it. They're connecting to see their family and friends, first of all. We can see business travellers heading out through the airport, and we can see the opposite coming inbound. So that movement has started to happen. And let's remember that Auckland Airport, and Auckland is the place where 93% of this country's high-value exports by air leave this country and head out to markets. And we've seen how important that is during the pandemic. We're really proud, of course, at Auckland Airport to be the place where all that is starting to happen, and there's a responsibility from our perspective to keep working on that. But let's make no mistake, that recovery is very fragile. We are in competition with other cities, destinations and countries for that air capacity, shipping capacity and cruise capacity. So we need to make sure that we are projecting confidence to the world in the stability of our settings, and that we're getting back to business. So I think, my final thing is let's give the innovators, the visitors, the students, and the other people that want to re-engage with us the confidence that we're open for business and that we want to reconnect with them. Thanks.
That's excellent. Thank you, Scott. So, of course, there's no point, Scott, doing the work that he's doing with his colleagues and connecting to the rest of the world if we're not able to attract great talent and great entrepreneurial talent and innovators. And that's where our next panellist, Rosalie Nelson, comes in. Now, Rosalie has been in front of you already today, chairing one of our previous panels, but she's participating in this panel in her capacity as the Chief Executive of the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, which is a non-profit organisation that has partnered with Immigration New Zealand to attract world-class innovators to Aotearoa. Rosalie began her career in business journalism, which certainly gets my vote, and moved to the forecasting of technology disruption, market strategy and innovation systems in New Zealand, the Asia Pacific and Europe. Her last role before her current role was as General Manager of Strategy for Callaghan Innovations, so she knows a thing or two about how to get great people here and keep them. Rosalie, over to you.
Kia ora koutou. Look, I feel very privileged to be leading the Edmund Hillary Fellowship because what I hear and see is a perspective on New Zealand that we don't always get to hear. And a part of that is that they see us as an identity, less about just place and space. They see a country that has brings values to what it does and epitomises those values. And our response in the early days of COVID actually reinforced that for many of them. And so there is a real opportunity for Aotearoa New Zealand to attract talent right now because our profile internationally, for many of those that are looking for a new place to begin new ventures, to bring their resources and capital, our profile has never been higher, but it is a narrowing window of opportunity because the rest of the world is very much competing for that talent. They're often offering incentives that we don't actually have. So I guess my key message right now is that we have an opportunity to reimagine how we attract talent to Aotearoa New Zealand. And there's a few just principles on that. I think the first thing is actually getting the clarity on our value proposition. Let's face it, New Zealand's not really known internationally for our innovation. But at the same time, we have extraordinary innovation that is actually taking place here. So how do we begin to attract based on our values, based on our regulatory system and political stability, which is actually something that is very attractive to people? How do we attract people based on our diversity, that we are a multicultural society, but we are based as a bicultural nation, and embedded within that are the principles of kaitiakitanga and manaakitanga, which is a different way of how we approach business to the rest of the world. I would also just add to that, how do we start to think not just about the workforce gap and the skills that we need there, but how we attract the future skills that we need for this country. if we really want to transform our economies, if we really want to address climate action and climate change over the longer term, we need transformative industries. And I think Izzy spoke this morning about Web3, about metaverse, about some of these cutting edge areas where we could attract the very best in the world to Aotearoa New Zealand and use that opportunity to cross-skill and upskill. But the only other points that I would add to this is that attracting people here is not enough in and of itself. We have to very consciously think, how do we culturally induct them into our country and help them to recognise and also begin to walk the walk that all of us are taking right now to be tangata tiriti and really honour the treaty. So that's one piece of it, but then also how are we good partners to those that do come in? We have an enormous opportunity to cross-skill and upskill with the talent that we attract to this country, but quite often what tends to happen is, you don't have the New Zealand connections, you don't quite know the New Zealand way, and we're not necessarily active in how do we begin to integrate people into this country and welcome them and actually make the most of their diversity of thinking and often the cutting edge thinking that they can bring. So those are probably my key points for today.
That's lovely. Thank you, Rosalie. Well, look, I'm reflecting there on your spirited advocacy for manaakitanga and skills attraction. And the man to your left also has a key eye on the need for skills attraction and making sure that we are really good hosts once we attract our skilled workforce to New Zealand. I also want to say a special thank you to Mark, who I'm about to introduce, because Mark has joined this panel at the last minute after one of his colleagues came down with COVID. So Mark, thank you for showing your ability to pivot at the last minute and join this panel. So Mark Spencer joins us from Beca. He has been at Beca, he tells me, since graduating from Auckland University, a fine establishment, in the 1980s. For the past 2 decades, he has held senior management positions and is now Group Director Buildings for Beca. He has staff in New Zealand, Asia and Australia, and is part of the Beca Group Executive Leadership Team. But he's also the board chair for the Committee of Auckland, and he tells me that he has a particular interest in the built environment and the roles that our buildings and places play in contributing to the well-being of the citizens here in Tāmaki Makaurau. So Mark, welcome and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Joanna. Just in response to that question, I suppose, about why is it important to reconnect Auckland with the rest of the world, I was just going to share an anecdote from a recent trip. I've had the opportunity to make a couple of short overseas trips in the last couple of months, one to Melbourne, which was quite a culture shock actually, because suddenly nobody was wearing a mask at any time other than on a public transport or in the airport. But most recently I just got back about a week ago from visiting Singapore and Bangkok. And when I was in Bangkok, just before I flew out, I had a meeting with Jonathan Kings, our new ambassador to Thailand. He's only been on the ground, I think, since February. Would have had as they do, a period of intense language education initially. So he's only been in the seat really for a month or two. But the comment he did make, and I'm sure this would resonate with Phil O'Reilly if he's still in the room, was I was only the second business person from New Zealand that they'd had in the country so far, whereas the Australians, Canadians and so on have been up there for months already. So that issue of having to sort of get on a plane and get out there and reconnect is really, really important, I think. The other thing I was just going to comment on was listening to the news driving in this morning was around the low uptake of students for I was horrified initially. Donald and I work in the tertiary education sector over the years with this suggestion that we were only going to allow 5,000 foreign students into the country. Well, as of yesterday, I think they've processed less than 1/10 of that in terms of number of visas. So it's probably another example of we just need to appreciate that the rest of the world is up and running and we're playing catch up. So I think that's the other important thing. And just final point was, in terms of getting people in, there's been much discussion, and I think the final session today talks about reinvigorating the city centre. It is in a pretty parlous state. There are still all those fears about is it dangerous at night time and so on. So getting international visitors, who tend to be the people that occupy the centre of the city, getting our students back on campus, getting international students living in the city again, vitally important for the future of Auckland.
Yeah, well, look, thank you, Mark. Isn't it so strange that we're sitting here talking about culture shock going to across the Tasman? Who knew that we would be in this place? And reinforcing those comments that you make about the importance of the face-to-face connections, and I think Phil spoke really clearly on that this morning also. Now, speaking of face-to-face, our final guest down the end there is Michelle Hooper, who has a really big job with the nation's expectations on your shoulders, Michelle. I don't want to freak you out. Michelle is the tournament director for the Rugby World Cup, which is due to be hosted in Auckland and Northland later this year, as you all know, following a delay from COVID. But supercharging women's rugby on our shores will be a breeze for Michelle, despite all of the challenges that the tournament has faced. She's delivered a number of major international sporting events worldwide for World Rugby, FIFA, and for the America's Cup. So Michelle, it's wonderful to have you here to talk to us about why reconnecting with the rest of the world is so important in a major events context.
Thank you, Joanna, and it's delightful to be here. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. We have one goal this year, that is to supercharge the women's game of rugby here in Aotearoa. I feel like we're coming out of the tunnel and into the spotlight exactly where women's rugby deserves to be. We have our one goal is to have a sellout crowd at Eden Park for the opening match day on the 8th of October 2022 at our own very famous World Rugby Stadium, Eden Park. Now, why that's important is because sport is a vehicle for social change. It is a momentous vehicle for social change. It represents so much more, and not just sport, but major events, in terms of what we as New Zealanders stand for and represent. And I think the number one thing about reconnecting with the world and the role of major international events is that we are open for business and reaffirming our place on the world stage as a global player. And I know that with a population of, I'm trying to think, was it 4 million or 5 million, but between 4 and 5 million New Zealanders, we bat well above our weight. And the number one thing that shows that is our place on the world stage. And later on in the piece, I'll get into the detail, the broadcast numbers, the reach, everything else about the events. But number one, for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, right here in Tāmaki Makaurau on the 8th of October, we're going for a world record attendance for women's rugby. And the reason that's important is that in football, they just achieved 93,000 for a football match offshore. That's a world record for football, for women's football. We just had 16,000 attendance, which is a world record for England rugby, for one of their Six Nations matches. And we've come out very publicly to say that our opening match day at Eden Park here for the women's game, we want to get a sellout crowd. The sellout crowd, the record is 21,000. If we achieve that, we'll get the record. But we don't want just that. We want to show how much rugby means to us as a nation and how much we value the women's game. So it's a great honour to be here, and I look forward to talking more about those in more detail. I think one thing I did want to add was that when I was a 16-year-old girl and New Zealand had just won the America's Cup, and I was down on Queen Street in my Epsom Girls Grammar School uniform, standing there with my red socks pulled up to my knees, the light bulb moment happened for me, and I thought I wanted to get into major international events. And here I am 25 years later, having had a fabulous career in major international sport. So a really big part of that is connecting our rangatahi to opportunities globally as well through sport and through major international events that we bring here. So Joanna, look forward to questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Michelle. Well, I think we all need to make sure that we do turn out and support our women as they hit the field, if only to honour that picture of the young ex-girls with their red socks pulled up to their knees. So thank you very much, Michelle. So look, what we want to do in the first part of the session is to do a little bit of a stock take. Where are we at? We've had 2 years where we've gone through a profound event that none of us imagined would occur within our lifetimes. Zion, if I can throw to you as somebody who was working offshore for much of that period and is now here in Aotearoa, how do you think New Zealand and Tāmaki Makaurau are perceived offshore, if at all? And what do we need to do to cut through the noise as the rest of the world has reignited?
Well, I was lucky enough to live in 4 continents, so I can speak from different parts of the world and the perception of New Zealand. And when the people that travel here, 2 things are very, very consistent. In no particular order, it's our beautiful countryside. When people come back and they talk about how beautiful our country is, and at the same level, they talk about our beautiful people. And so every single person around the world say the same 2 things. Where I think our opportunity is to start telling stories. This is where I think we have so much opportunity in Auckland, so much heritage, the most amazing melting cultural pot here in the South Pacific. but they're not coming back saying this was an amazing story. This is what I felt, and this is how I was connected. And it's here. It's just how do we bring that all together to ensure when they come back, they're talking about 3 things and not just 2. So I think there's a massive opportunity. I was in the Cook Islands a couple of weeks ago, and my favourite day was on a boat with 4 locals, and they taught me about the mountains, the rivers, the turtles going past, and I was fascinated. Everything was storytelling. We have that. How do we just turn that into a real amazing asset to attract more people? And then they come back and bring more tourism here as well.
And to what extent do you think that those offshore perceptions that people have of this country, to what extent do we hold those perceptions ourselves? And are we proud enough of our country?
Thanks for putting me on the spot. It's unique. Again, just coming home, and I was born and raised, and I was born in South Auckland, raised in West Auckland. I'm a very, very proud Kiwi. But I now commute between Auckland and Christchurch. And I'm starting to get to know some people in Christchurch. Not one of them is talking about travelling to Auckland. Not one. Again, and there's just so much opportunity that we can really turn this into a much better situation. The perception of New Zealand through COVID was outstanding at the first phase. We were held up here. Trust me, I was going through the new administration with Biden coming in and the ex-guy going out. I forget his name. But we were the shining light. Now we've got to catch up. We are behind the 8 ball. And we've got to really, again, back to my earlier points, empathy, ensuring equity, but at the same time, employees now hold the control, not the employer. So you've got to make sure you're doing right for your people. They'll stay here if they really feel a purpose and a connection, and then we'll be okay.
So that sense of purpose, connection, pride that Zion speaks of, I wonder, Michelle, what role do major events play in driving those forces and that pride? And how competitive is Auckland and New Zealand in bidding for major events?
Well, I think that I've got 4 key areas really in this regard, and the first one is broadcast and duration of events. So I think the number one thing with international events is that global audience reach. So if you look at some of the events we've recently hosted, so the Rugby World Cup 2017 was hosted in Ireland. They had 35 million cumulative views, which wasn't a lot, and it was a very small tournament at that point. You look at the America's Cup, which was hosted here in 2021 in March, they had 941 million cumulative views, 52 hours of non-stop live television from our shores here in Aotearoa. And can I add, they were incredible images we were sending offshore in the height of the European pandemic. Of Waitemata Harbour, Rangitoto, it was spectacular. The ICC Women's Cricket World Cup they're about to announce some incredibly impressive broadcast figures, which I will let them announce. The FIFA Women's World Cup, which is an absolute mega event, that's still on our shores. We're co-hosting with Australia next year. By all standards, they blow everybody out of the water, but 1.12 billion views through their official broadcast channels in 2019 in France. So when you think about, and these events go for, it's not just a day, it's not just a week, they go for a month or 6 weeks. And every time that someone is reconnecting with those images, they're connecting with a snapshot of New Zealand and at those moments that it's on TV. The second part for me is about reaffirming beliefs, about international beliefs about what New Zealand represents. So, when we're talking about being open for business, we're talking about being a world player on the global stage. We're talking about, clean, green, why that's so important that we optimise that because it's something people think about us, but are we living up to it? So our values as a country and as Tāmaki Makaurau as a city, those are the sort of things we can get across in that broadcast about what people think of us as a country. And, I watched the ICC Women's Cricket World Cup and I was so incredibly proud that we were delivering that when we knew all the lockdown restrictions, we knew everything that was happening. And then they got that sellout match day on the final round of the tournament at Hagley Park, and it was an Australia-England final, which was absolutely outstanding, So that's why it's super important. So it reaffirms our beliefs globally and also locally about ourselves as a country. It's a platform for New Zealanders to connect with people at an emotional, passionate level. So people are passionate about sport, they're passionate about music, they're passionate about the arts, and when we host these major international events, we connect with them at an emotional level. So it's a much deeper connection than just an advertisement on television. We're talking to them in the language that they love, and they're responding to us in the language that they love. And they see that fern mark broadcast and painted all over the world. And then they say, right, they see the logo on the meat package at the supermarket. And they say, oh, New Zealand made. Gosh, they bet above their weight, that little small country way back down there in the southern hemisphere. So, that's why this reassurance and reaffirmation is so key in terms of everything that we do. And the fourth part for me, which is critical, and as I talked about the Queen Street and that personal experience for me, but the touch point with New Zealanders, it's an opportunity for Kiwis to get alongside, see these international events, be transported for a moment in time. You walk in and, Mount Eden and Eden Park, you walk in the gate, and then all of a sudden you're in this international environment. There's the lights, the glitz, the broadcast worldwide to all these people that are watching. And then you walk back out the gate and you're back in, Mount Eden. So it's incredible, and they only come once in a lifetime. It's not like we can reinvent that again. It's an incredible opportunity that we're so lucky to have here. And I think, how are we doing? I think, we look at Auckland. Auckland's an absolute leader in this. We've got 4 of the best world international women's events coming here. And over the next 2 years, Auckland Unlimited are a great partner for all of us in that. It's about talking about our excellence and our competitive advantages. We wouldn't have secured these events without Auckland's contribution and being a key stakeholder in that.
That's great. So, Michelle, what I'm hearing is this enormous sense of passion, this pride, this energy that comes with the hosting of events here. Scott, listening to that, the importance of connectivity that comes through the comments from both Zion and Michelle, are we reconnecting fast enough? You talk about the fragility of those connections. Are we moving hard enough and fast enough?
Yeah, good question. So pre-COVID, Auckland Airport was served by something like 29 airlines that flew to 43 cities. And of course, those airlines flew here because we offered them, good commercial terms to operate on. There was strong demand for travel in and out of this country, and there were strong cargo flows. Of course, that network has, got to the point that it has now because of, the 2 years of COVID restrictions. And we're now sort of at the point where we have 16 airlines flying to 29 cities. So there's a long way back. And I think whilst, of course, airports, tourism and our partners are working hard to re-establish those connections and that really important network, because let's remember we are a geographically isolated country. We can't go by train to next door. So we do need those air connections. So, and I think the thing that we need to remember is that aircraft are mobile capital assets. The airlines can choose to deploy them between any 2 cities almost on the face of the globe. So what they're looking for, particularly at the moment where they have decimated balance sheets, they've got less fleet, they've got less staff resources, they're looking for, certainty and sure things to back. And we are a little bit late to the party. So, those airlines with the available resources that they've got, they have, to a certain extent, put those aircraft and their staff into other places. So, we do have to work extra hard to get that networking connectivity back. We always had to because, we're geographically isolated, it's expensive to fly here. But pre-COVID, 29 international carriers saw it as a great place to do business. So, look, we will attract those links back in time, but really what we need to do is to, of course, shorten the duration that it takes. So I just want to reassure that, of course, within sort of Tourism Inc., there is, a good body of work and a lot of cooperation going on to work with the airlines to bring those connections back. But, it's not instant. Airlines cannot turn on a switch and turn up here tomorrow. It does take them months to restart fleet that's been mothballed and to re-employ staff. We'll get there. The other things that we just need to really focus on is the certainty. So, airlines need certainty that if they decide to commit their resources to this market, that our border settings are going to be stable. And that we are going to continue to commit to the path to remove friction from the travel system. So really pleased to see that things like pre-departure tests for travel to New Zealand will be removed by the end of July. It'd be great to see if it was a little bit earlier to get us into step with the rest of the world. And then, of course, those airlines, their customers. It's a big commitment to come to New Zealand. We're a once-in-a-lifetime trip for some people. So being certain that when you come here, that's going to happen, that the thousands of dollars you're going to spend and the time commitment, that you're going to get a return on that, is a really important thing versus all of the other destinations that we're in competition with. So, certainty and confidence is a really big thing, and that's difficult at the moment, of course. But I guess the good news is that what we're seeing in the Northern Hemisphere, who are ahead of us through this current summer period in the Northern Hemisphere, is a very strong recovery in travel. Canada, for example, their air capacity is almost back to 90% of what it was pre-COVID. So Canadians are travelling like it was 2019, same in the US and in Europe. So, what is going to be very critical is this coming summer for us. Making sure that we can get open and provide the confidence.
Yeah, so that confidence is required, as you rightly point out. Airlines are making commercial decisions, leisure visitors are making decisions. But Rosalie, business visitors, innovators and entrepreneurs are also making decisions about where they invest their time and their skills. 270 AHF Fellows were not able to travel to New Zealand during COVID because their visas didn't allow it. What impact did that have on your cohort, and what has their response been?
Yeah, it was fascinating. I joined in March last year, and we've got, just for those of you who perhaps don't know much about the fellowship, we've got 526 fellows. 404 of them are international, and there's a huge span, there's a huge portfolio ranging from investors, entrepreneurs, social impact leaders, educators, technologists, scientists. It's a pretty wide portfolio from about 47 different countries. The challenge that we faced is that they'd been accepted into the fellowship, and normally that was the precursor for being able to get this global impact visa. The challenge was, of course, that our borders closed, and we literally had fellows that had sold houses, had their goods being shipped en route to the country, and were at the mother-in-law's house with their suitcases and their kids, finding that they were suddenly trapped. Look, what I would say is during this time, we actually went back to them and we said, look, we fully understand if your personal circumstances have changed, if your feelings towards New Zealand have changed and you'd like to withdraw. Only 2 had to, for very, very understandable and personal reasons. They were understanding because they actually believed that New Zealand initially was doing the right thing. We were following a science-led approach. They were seeing often chaos within their own countries. So they were very accepting of it, but it became very tough at the point where we were opening but changing dates, when we had the chaos of MIQ, when some were being allowed in, others were, and so I think this piece of certainty became very, very difficult. So we're now welcoming about 270 fellows in over this next year, but a key part for us will be actually that everything doesn't change again, and they actually have some certainty because they are planning their lives around it.
So that theme of certainty we've heard right throughout the day today. Mark, well, look, we are running tight on time, but one of the pieces of certainty was foreshadowed by the government last week with the Green List, which specifies skills and the skills that we need, and a certainty of pathway for those people. Do you think that's enough if we are going to give people, businesses and industry certainty as they seek to attract talent into New Zealand?
It's certainly a step in the right direction. I think very much in the vein of what you were just talking about, it's a huge life decision, obviously, to change countries. So the sorts of things that we might need to think about as far as immigration settings go is whether there's what we're going to do around accompanying family members, and that might be older family members as well, because that's a disincentive for somebody if they are travelling to the far side of the world, is that separation from parents, and obviously a lot of people in the last few years would have had the devastating situation where they were unable to see people again before they lost them. So I think that's a really big factor, and it's hugely important. What we're observing and talking to consulting firms in the States, in the UK, is they're all there with their arms open, waiting for our people to turn up. The traditional Kiwi OE has been something that they almost had baked into their industries, and we're anticipating certainly some pent-up demand in that regard. So we are going to see an outflow. We're trying to front foot that, I suppose, in developing some more sophisticated responses that makes a bit more of a catch and release, release and catch back perhaps kind of model. But yeah, everything we can do to really improve the situation for anybody coming from overseas, I think is going to be essential in the current war for talent.
Thank you very much. Now, look, we are getting a flashing signal that we need to end this panel. I feel like we could have talked about this for hours, and indeed, I hope these conversations do continue from this point onwards. I think some of the themes that I have heard very strongly from our panellists today is that we do need to provide certainty, we need to move harder and faster to communicate the offering of Aotearoa and Tāmaki Makaurau to the world. We need to be ready. We need to be ready to welcome visitors here, to make sure that we've got the infrastructure to support those people. And when people arrive on our shores, that we do integrate them into our communities, whether it's our industry communities, our entrepreneurial communities, or as leisure visitors or skilled workers into our industry, or people who are turning up to cheer on our women on the field for the Rugby World Cup. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to host this panel. Can you please thank our wonderful panellists, world-class panellists for being here today.